Right, I'm very pleased to say that we can go into our first session of the day. And I know people always say that someone needs no introduction when they go on to introduce someone, but our first speaker really does need no introduction. He has played such an important role over the last year in standing up for local communities, making the case for devolution and making the case for community power. So I'm really pleased to welcome Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, who's going to be speaking on community power and devolution, why you can't have one without the other. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Good morning, everybody. I feel bad about my pink background. It would have helped me look like I could escape my prison cell if I'd have found a way of putting it up, but I'm not that tech savvy, I'm afraid. But it's fantastic to join you all this morning, and it's absolutely the conference and the conversation to be having right now, because as the animation just said, I mean, there are amazing things happening and have been happening over the last 12 months as communities have supported themselves to get through this. But at the same time, we've seen a sort of a centralizing of power, haven't we, back to the centre, and a sort of mindset that says we'll run everything from a room in Whitehall, and we've seen the consequences of that. So this conference is about kind of pulling the debate back, I think, to where it needs to be, and it is about saying that 21st century change should be bottom-up change, not top-down imposed change. And I'm going to start by just saying something about your chair, the wonderful Donna Hall, because I was a creature of top-down systems, being a minister in the Blair and Brown governments and a frontbench MP. When Donna was chief executive of Wigan Council, I was kind of coming out of government in the difficult period when we were kind of grappling with the cuts for the first time. And I'm going to risk of embarrassing her to say that I just learned so much from Donna. The council that she led at the time, Wigan Council, had been without wanting to sort of say it was a sort of meaning any ill will or anything. It was quite a top-down council in its own backyard, and its writ was what happened, and people were told to do what they said. It was quite a patrician view of things, and Donna just totally and utterly turned that on its head, and I watched that happen, and I experienced the change of when Wigan Council became a bottom-up empowering council rather than a sort of top-down dictatorial council. And I can't tell you what it was to experience that change, how energizing it was. And I kind of was on a bit of a journey by that point, away from Westminster and towards perhaps the role that I now hold. And I've got the what do they say, the zeal of the convert about the importance of empowering the local and starting there, because it's a simple thing, isn't it, to kind of address the theme of this morning. You can't level up the country top down from Whitehall. If that's what you think you can do, you're going to fail. And actually, the government that I was in tried to do that, and it failed when it tried to do that. If you go back to the middle of last year in the summer, when Greater Manchester went under local restrictions, it was at the same time when parts of East Lancashire and West Yorkshire also went under local restrictions. We were one of the first areas to go under. And people remarked at the time that it was almost the exact geography of the housing pathfinder schemes of the Labour government of the early 2000s, where people tried to impose new communities on people from hundreds of miles away. And unsurprisingly, they told them what to do with it. And it failed. And it's a salutary lesson that Whitehall should have learned, but they never learn it, unfortunately. They constantly try to hold on to all of the power. And I'm afraid we saw that in the budget last week. Levelling up has become a very top-down exercise where the Treasury holds all the power, and it makes places queue up in a beauty parade, and it says, oh, we'll give some money to this one over there, but no, you're going to get nothing over there. This is the way it uses its power. Scattering bits of funding out and making everybody go through a bidding process. It's like the tyranny of the Whitehall bidding process that's so kind of, I don't know, energy consuming, but also demoralizing, particularly for the areas that lose out. And actually you take capital off places. You don't just not give them anything. You actually take energy out of places when they lose out in this constant Whitehall bidding round. And I just think we've got to win this argument now coming out of the pandemic, that if this country is to be levelled up, if levelling up is to be a unifying agenda that everybody can buy into, they're going to have to move away from a top-down, divisive, politicised approach to it. And they're going to have to start thinking about truly devolving power, truly devolving funding, and letting communities decide for themselves where the priorities should go. If we look at what's happened during the pandemic, we've got to advance an argument that levelling up has got to start with people rather than infrastructure that may or may not be delivered in 20 or 30 years' time. Look at the death rate from COVID around the country. You will see that in our poorest communities, it's 2.5 times what it is in the most affluent. And what is driving that? It's a combination of low-paid, insecure work and poor quality, insecure housing. You know, it's been really striking to me working over the last year, as you say, Adam, trying to speak up for communities and seeing it come back, the blame game immediately on the people in those communities. It comes back from the predictable quarters that it's the people to blame and not actually the fact that they are trapped in a situation where they cannot protect their own health. If they're in a job where they won't be paid if they need to self-isolate, or they fear losing their job if they self-isolate, and then they have to go home to a private rented home where the landlord simply doesn't invest anything in the upkeep of it, and people live in fear of losing it from one week to the next if they haven't paid their rent. That is the reality of life for far too many people in the UK. Even before the pandemic, it was estimated that 20%, not estimated, 20% of British adults said in a survey that their housing situation was damaging their health. And when they said that, I think they meant their mental health. So levelling up, as far as I'm concerned, starts with people. It starts with people's work, which we need to ensure is good work, fairly rewarded work, secure work, and it starts with improving people's housing. Because without those foundations, I don't think you can empower communities to be in charge of their own destiny. And this is a version of levelling up that is completely different to what we were given last week. One of the things I really learned leaving Whitehall was it just allows you to look at life from a completely different perspective. When you are in a Whitehall government department, as I was as health secretary, number one, you're trapped in a policy silo, so you're only dealing with part of the world in a community, i.e. the health element. There's other elements that obviously communities deal with, but also from the telescope out of that Whitehall department, you can only see numbers. You can't see names because you're too far away. And the thing about the role that I currently occupy is that you can do the opposite. You can start with names, not numbers. And when that's your starting point, I think the possibilities are so much more endless from that. And you can start to break down the silos and allow people to personalize the support that we can provide. And particularly when you take power out of Whitehall and vest it in an area like Greater Manchester, you create the opportunity to open up the conversation about the use of that power to a much greater number of people. So I've been in the business of the last few years of setting up a number of panels at the Greater Manchester level, a race equality panel, a women and girls panel, a youth combined authority, LGBT panel, because we want everybody to be involved in the conversation about devolution in Greater Manchester and be involved in the changes that might happen. But I just think there's some, for all of this to happen properly, I think every layer has to take on a responsibility to play its part. So if you look at government has to devolve and let go, and it has to pass power down and out if we are to allow people to have more ability to shape their own destiny and communities to have more power in their hands. So that's a prerequisite. But obviously when power comes down to the regional or the local level, the public bodies who are in receipt of that devolved power need to trust their own voluntary and community sector and their social enterprise sector to become equal partners in the use of that power. And that doesn't happen. And this is what Donna Hall taught me. You know, the trust needs to be there, the trust of communities, but also the trust of the organisations that are embedded within those communities. And they can't be put through hoops and always given annual funding allocations or project funding. In my view, they should be brought in as long-term partners with core funding. So they're not worrying from one year to the next about paying the staff, that they are there as trusted partners for the long haul, that it's a shared endeavour, improving life in the communities. And people build relationships over the long haul, that importance of relationships that always comes out in the work of Hilary Cottam and others. That is in the end what makes things work, where people trust each other, they're working together towards a common aim. But there's a challenge too for the voluntary and community sector here, because sometimes it can be as competitive as the private sector, quite territorial and kind of guarding its sort of its role or its territory. And I think it's got to learn to be more collaborative. And I just want to point to an example in Greater Manchester, which I think has really shown the power of devolution when everybody really starts to pull in the same direction. When I came in as mayor, I said I wanted to end rough sleeping, and I stand by that commitment. It was 3 years before the government committed to everyone in, and what we've learned in the last 3 years is it's perfectly possible to achieve it. What has happened in Greater Manchester, having set that mission for the city region, people have more and more bought into it. The public bodies have bought into it. The voluntary community sector has bought into it. And we are a million miles further on now than where we were just a few years ago. And I think it's a model of how, if you devolve power, and then the power is then passed out, in our case, to the Homelessness Action Network, so people are involved in developing the policies. The flagship policy we have of A Bed Every Night in Greater Manchester, which looks after over 500 people every single night, and will do tonight. That didn't come from me, it came from somebody within our faith community who said that we needed to move away from a situation where we were offering just one night here and one night there to giving people not just a bed, the same bed every night. And that is what the scheme does. And I think this is a really good example of how you can use power. If you get everybody pulling in the same direction rather than ploughing their own furrow, you can make a real difference. And we have on the rough sleeping figures in Greater Manchester, and I hope we will continue to do so. So I think there's lessons for everybody at every level of this. It's a journey, isn't it? And it requires everybody to play their part. I have looked at the work that's going on around food in Greater Manchester as well, and I think where you develop collaboratives, networks of organisations dealing with issues like food poverty or homelessness within boroughs or across the city region, that is when real change starts to happen, when the level of collaboration kind of really goes up a level. And that's what I'm interested in building as we go forward, putting that infrastructure on the strongest of foundations and saying that as long as I'm in the role, or as long as devolution in Greater Manchester is around, we will work with you as equal partners, and we will set our goals together and then try and meet them together. So we're, I guess somewhere along the journey. We're not, 100% yet where we need to be. But I do think you can see in what we're doing in Greater Manchester the beginnings of a different way of doing things. And the main thing that I would point to in closing would be just the different, if you like, terms of trade for working in this way. When we're in the Whitehall situation working with people, there's always a sense of here's a senior kind of partner dictating to a more junior partner at the lower level. And it's also the case that the dysfunctional approach of Whitehall is, short term. It's based on sound bites and gimmicks, the latest fad. It's not about long-term change. It's often frustrating because ministers get moved around and people get demoralized trying to work with it. And it is, of course, also based on party. And that, by definition, is a divisive force because immediately you're starting from a divisive point. The thing about devolution is it starts with place. And when you start with place, and you start with names, not numbers, and you start with communities, you are starting with a naturally unifying force. Because wherever people are coming from politically, they will believe in the place, they will want the place to do better. So what you've got is the conditions for bringing people together and obviously tapping the kind of energy that people have in wanting to see their place improve. So I've come to the view that if we want to improve the way politics is done in this country, devolution is a prerequisite for it, because we've got to move beyond the quite stale, divisive debates of the past. We've got to get beyond a fairly dysfunctional Westminster system. I was speaking to a former colleague who I used to work with in Westminster recently, who said, do you have the experience when you go back there and you look in, it's like looking into a crack.
Andy, sorry, we lost your sound just one moment.
I'll finish because that's probably a good sign, isn't it? I was just saying that when people go back to Westminster who've been in there a long time, you go back and you think, God, was I really a part of that? Someone was saying it's like a house full of strange, a crack house where everyone's kind of exhibiting really strange behavior and a bit addictive behavior. And it is a bit like that. And we've got to help Westminster reform itself, and we've got to get power out of it and share it more across the English regions. I'm a convert, as I said, and I've signed up to the Donna Hall philosophy of life. I would launch a campaign to make Donna Hall Prime Minister if she would stand. A few nods there going on, Donna. I can feel a campaign brewing, but there's a movement that's been built that Donna's been massively important in. You're all clearly a part of it as well. This is an argument that has to be won coming out of this pandemic. If we allow levelling up to be dictated top down, if we allow a centralising tendency to take over again, I seriously worry where this country is going to be. God forbid, should the next pandemic hit us. Change is needed, major change is needed. It's root and branch, it's building from the bottom up. It's about people, names, not numbers. That's what we're trying to do in Greater Manchester. The more you give us, the more we will do. I will hand back and be more than happy to take anyone's questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was such a great contribution. And I can see in the chat you've already launched the Donna for PM campaign, which we will sign up to immediately. I messed up really badly. I was so excited to introduce you. I completely forgot to introduce Heather Jameson, who most people will know is an absolute stalwart of the local government sector, editor of Municipal Journal. Heather's going to be talking to Andy now and feeding the questions through from the chat. Over to you, Heather. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Adam. I don't think I quite fit into the doesn't need an introduction in the same way as you do, Andy. Thank you very much for that. It was a great start. I can see we have got loads of questions coming in, so I won't take up too many of my own. But before we launch into the Donna Hall for PM campaign, I mean, there's quite a lot of people pitching you for PM. Is that something? Would you consider going back into the crack den?
I've got to get lots of grief from my ex-colleagues about that now, aren't I? I genuinely kind of felt when I left that I was leaving it for good, and I didn't do what I'm doing now as a stepping stone. I'm standing again in May to be Mayor of Greater Manchester. I was asked, I mean, the honest truth is I would never say never, in that I clearly had the ambition to be leader of the Labour Party at one point, so it's pointless me saying it's completely gone. But I can't really see the circumstances in which it happens, and the danger of it, of course, is it reinforces everything I've just been arguing against, which is that Westminster's the only show in town. If someone like me says, you know what, I'm going back, it kind of defeats the object of what we're trying to build. So I personally believe this is worth investing in, building up. I mean, obviously, if you kind of went back, you then could really devolve if you got into a position of influence and power. But the honest answer is no, I'm not plotting a return to Westminster. I do think this current job I'm in will be my last job in British politics, and I'm determined to make it a good one and a success. So that's the honest answer, Heather.
Okay. I personally subscribe to the Gus O'Donnell view that all civil servants and politicians should do a stint in local government so that Definitely. They understand. The other thing that I would say is during the budget last week, I think we're all a little disappointed. I know you sort of addressed this at the APPG yesterday, but we're all a little bit disappointed of the lack of devolution in the budget. There's a school of thought that's saying that it's your fault because you gave government too much grief. What would you have put into the budget last week if you had been in Rishi Sunak's shoes in terms of devolution?
Just on that first point, people do say that, but really, isn't this the point? That if Whitehall is so fragile that it won't accept anybody saying, hang on a minute, a 67% furlough is going to damage people here, and restricting our businesses without a self-employment support scheme is going to hurt people. If it's so fragile that it won't accept people doing that, then I think we're in a dangerous place if we then say, oh well, I'll keep quiet then from now on, because that suggests everyone has to go on bended knee to Whitehall with a begging bowl, and that just perpetuates the power imbalance. I made the point about Wigan Council. Wigan Council learned to give some of its power to communities. Whitehall needs to learn to give its power and trust people at a local level, because actually it's more accountable power when you live in those communities. It's not particularly accountable when you're 200 miles away and you're making decisions that affect those communities. That's not accountable power in my view, and it's actually not good decision making. They need to understand that if you vest power in local places, you're creating more accountability, and you are likely to create better decision making that will spend public money better. What would I have done if I was Rishi Sunak in the budget? I would have done a lot differently, actually, beyond some immediate things on the pandemic around fixing self-isolation support, beyond bringing people excluded from public support into the main support schemes. I would absolutely have shored up the local government financial base. See, this is what's frustrating for me about this Towns Fund. They're giving money out here for things that councils would have been able to do themselves 10 or 15 years ago. I looked at some of the allocations. Some of it was for repaving of high streets and building of toilets and stuff that councils could have done themselves. And now the Treasury is expecting applause because it's giving them, they're on a list and they're getting £10 million or something. It's like that we're going backwards here. This isn't leveling up. This is going backwards. I would have, to be honest, laid the foundations for a substantial devolution of power over housing, because I think we have to start with housing coming out of the pandemic, a major programme of housing improvement, particularly in our poorest communities, devolved post-16 skills to develop a skills capability at the regional level to rise to the challenge of the green economy. I would have devolved, well, to be fair to them, they did hint that they are moving towards a devolved transport capital settlement, which is good, but they should have got on with it more quickly. And I would have created the framework through which all English cities could move towards a London-style public transport system, which I think is essential if we're to unlock opportunity within our communities. So, I mean, I could go on, I won't, Heather, but there are so many things that could have been done, that should have been done, that weren't done. If we're going to recover from this pandemic, the UK PLC has to fire on all cylinders, not just central government, but regional and local government as well. Everybody has to be empowered and their capacity has to be engaged. And it looks to me as though they're just trying to run the really old school thing of run it all from SW1A. OAA. It didn't work for the government I was in, and it won't work for them either.
Yeah, but all governments centralised once they've got power. Right, good. Moving on to questions from the audience. We've got Chris Dabbs here, who's asking, how can city regions ensure that power is not centralised in cities but shared throughout the region? I think there's quite a lot of concern about stuff coming to Greater Manchester and the other combined authorities, not moving down into local government and not moving down into communities. How do you see that panning out?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris. I mean, it's why I've tried to create the infrastructure at the GM level with all of the people's panels to ensure that there isn't just sort of remote decision making at that level. Now it's work in progress, but that is the intention, to create that challenge function at that level. Our 10 councils in Greater Manchester, as you will know, Chris, do not like handing power up to the GM level. They will fiercely, they fiercely resist that, and rightly, because power should be kept at the most local level possible. It's about finding the right level for different functions, isn't it? And the GM system is still in some ways sifting out some of that. But there are some ways in which better coordination across local authorities in the end is empowering of communities. A postcode lottery and the confusion that comes from that can be confusing for people, and a degree of standardization at the Greater Manchester level is not a bad thing necessarily. So it's about, I think we're feeling our way in many ways, but I certainly feel 4 years on that I now know how to drive what is a complex system. It is a complex kind of entity that I'm at the heart of. The government department's easier. You've just got levers and you can pull them. Greater Manchester is different because you've got, it's got to use softer power and influence. But actually, if this system can be made to work, the power of it is greater because it's coming from the bottom up and because it's got that kind of buy-in from communities. And I think our work on homelessness has proved that.
Okay, we've got Matt Clack asking here, how do we make sure the community empowerment agenda that we have created throughout the pandemic isn't lost when we go back to normal, whatever normal is?
Well, it's a really good question, Matt. I mean, I think as it stands, it might be lost because the finances of our voluntary and community organisations, charities, are shot to bits, aren't they? So councils are struggling, so they haven't got the funds to shore them up. They haven't been able to do the fundraising that they've ordinarily been able to do. And you asked me about the budget, Heather. Well, that was a massive missing piece in the budget, wasn't it? There's just a lack of recognition of the need for capacity within local organisations, be they in the voluntary community sector or indeed councils. I was really struck when we had the floods in Didsbury, where the Prime Minister planned this sort of whirlwind visit. He arrived and he praised the Environment Agency, he praised the Met Office, he praised Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, rightly, and Greater Manchester Police. But he didn't once mention Manchester City Council, who'd been out all night with volunteers from the community knocking on doors. And that was a very revealing thing to me, a very revealing thing, because it reveals not just how the Prime Minister thinks about things, but it reveals how pretty much everybody in Westminster and Whitehall thinks about things. They don't see councils and what they do in their entirety, and they take for granted often the work that the local VCSE sector does. And I think it's getting quite dangerous now because everyone has worked flat out over the last year. They've kind of moved mountains, actually. I've seen that with my own eyes. The community hubs have been brilliant. And I think, interestingly, councils have probably even gone further, I think, in embracing the role of the sector in terms of the everyday informal support that can be provided. I think the community hubs have shown that. And I hear from some of my chief execs locally that they want to keep what's been achieved through the hubs. The big risk for it is the financial base locally of both the sector and of the council. And I think that's a really serious issue.
Okay, thank you. We've got Khan Saheen, who's asking, what effect do you think moving government departments outside London will have on levelling up?
Not much. It never did. I mean, it's easy. It's an easy thing to make it look like you're levelling up. I'm not begrudging Darlington. I think it's great for Darlington, and I think it's good for Leeds to get the investment agency. But DWP was moved to all kinds of places. DWP had a big presence in a place near me in Ashton and Makerfield. It's good because it creates a number of jobs. It doesn't truly change where decision making is done. All governments have done it, but they tend to relocate the back office stuff. And it's good for jobs, don't get me wrong, it's good for profile, but it's a kind of classic Westminster fig leaf for not doing what they really should be doing, which is properly devolving power. It's kind of a thing that looks like they are, but they're not really, and that's why they do it.
Okay, would you move the political offices outside? Would you sort of shift the cabinet to Birmingham or Manchester?
I see absolutely no reason why not. I mean, I just, you know, the thing is, the thing that frustrates me more than ever is all of that stuff could help. When are we going to reform Parliament? Genuinely, I really mean this, because what you find as a constituency MP when you go into Parliament is you're not really empowered to be a place-based advocate, because you've got the party whip system to follow. And basically what happens in the Commons is the Commons rubber stamps what the government of the day wants, the civil servant. The Commons rubber stamps what the civil servants want, basically. Ministers can change it a bit, but you know, that's largely what happens. And then if things are to change, they get changed in the Lords. But you know, why are we not more, why at a conference like this, when we're talking about community power, are we not more outraged by the fact that our laws are made by unelected people, appointed people who largely live within the M25? That's where laws in our country get changed. And why are we not more outraged about that? When I looking back at the crack house, as I said, from here, I can't understand how that gets accepted. And I do notice when people go into Westminster, they kind of become part of it, and then they become reluctant to give up power, as you were saying before. And you can shuffle around government departments and entities all you like, but power has to move, doesn't it? True power has to move. And at the moment, I don't see how it will, given what we've got. I would have a regional Lords based on proportional representation, and that reform really needs to happen very, very soon, in my view, because you know Parliament isn't strong enough to hold the government to account, because the Commons rubber stamps and the Lords is only revising, and till that changes, then I don't think power in this country will really change.
Okay, and sort of following on from that, we've got Will Maplebeck asking if you were Prime Minister tomorrow, which we know now you're not going to be, certainly not tomorrow, how would you give more power to communities and local government?
I think you just have to set out a consistent programme of major devolution over everything that can be devolved to all regions of England. You have to show how you're going to fill in the map. We should, in my view, devolve the DWP budget. We should devolve post-16 education. We should give local government a role over education and schooling again. The academies reform was a completely centralising reform that took schools away from their communities towards less accountable chains. You have to set out, in my view, a broad programme for change where all parts of England can have a combined authority as well, so that they can be part of this and plot their own journey along this course. That's what I would do. Public spending should be controlled in the areas where it is spent, unless there is a very good reason not to do so. For instance, military spending, or other critical national spending on security, etc. But everything else, I would say, should be devolved. Fine for the government of the day to sort of set a framework around it, but as much as possible should be devolved, because I believe when you devolve it, it's not just the community power that it unlocks, Heather. You create the opportunity to break down the Whitehall silos and, as I say, join up the dots, spend money better. And the Treasury used to be in favour of devolution, and I'm just, for that reason, and I'm just surprised that it seems to have kind of pulled back from it in recent times. But you need a substantial programme of English devolution, and actually, I think you need to say to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland that they need to move to more bottom-up devolution rather than what also is quite top-down devolution that they currently have.
Okay, we've got Sophie Page asking, how do you see the community power initiatives like the Community Wealth Fund, where residents are put in charge of spending decisions, working alongside community, combined and local authorities? I
think they're great ideas, and I would want to support them completely. We do, I mean, even though we don't have formal structures like that, we do, as I say, try and involve people in decision making as much as we can. But I would go further and look at, truly devolved budgets or participatory budgets, whatever people call them. I think cities like Barcelona are doing a lot of that. Paris, there's some really amazing stuff that goes on in cities around the world. And the reason why we can't do as much of it is because we don't have the same powers as some of those cities. English cities are held back at the moment. We're not punching our weight on the world stage. I think you punch your weight when you unlock power from the bottom up and when you give residents the space to lead change. And absolutely would be all in favour of that. We're seeing the beginnings of it in some of our councils. The Preston model, really interesting, but there is so much further we could go with it.
Okay, and John Topham asks, how can communities insist that central government should devolve powers and resources? It's one of those, it's within the gift of central government to decide whether it's devolving or not, is it not?
It is, and that's why, it constantly falters, isn't it? As you said it, Heather, when people in opposition might promise it, but when they get into government, they become less keen. And I saw that when I was in. I'm not making an attack on the current government, although they have done that. They have promised it and then pulled back from it. I remember being in the Labour government in the 2003-4 period when we were looking at regional assemblies, and the hierarchy then gave lukewarm backing to John Prescott, at best, I would say. And actually, I was part of a body called Yes for the Northwest. We were the next ones to go after the Northeast was meant to have gained its independence. And obviously it never happened. It never happened partly because the powers that be just didn't invest in it. They didn't really kind of, put their shoulder to it. So it's a thing that afflicts all Westminster politicians, as I said before. When I was on Yes for the Northwest, I remember saying to some of my colleagues, are you getting involved? Oh, I'm not sure. I it's worked hard to get in here. I don't want to just give someone else, and that's what you get. And so it's a really tough nut to crack. And I guess one of the things I would say is increasingly let's maybe not wait for Westminster to that's why this movement is so important. Build the energy and almost kind of just take over the policy debates and shame them into having to do it.
Okay, don't wait for permission. Okay, Beverly Barnett is asking, how is Greater Manchester ensuring that marginalised communities and their lived experience are central to the community power shift?
Yes, that's a good question. Yesterday, I was chairing a meeting of our homelessness programme board, and we have people on the board who've been homeless. And it's a principle we absolutely try hard to live by. When Donna was in post in Greater Manchester, well, she still is, but when Wigan Council, our reform board that we've set up at the Greater Manchester level will also bring people into the room from not just the voluntary community sector, but people with lived experience. We try to live it. It's hard because obviously, easy to go into the default mode, but we absolutely do work hard to ensure that we involve all voices. And the panels we've set up at the Greater Manchester level are really important to us. Let me just give a further example. The Disabled People's Panel. I was really pleased I got it set up when I did, which was in late 2019, because it's performed a really valuable role during the pandemic. They did a survey of disabled people across our 10 boroughs, and I think some of what came through that survey would have been completely missed had they not done that piece of work, because there was a very differential experience of people who were disabled, and people with different disabilities had a different experience of the lockdown, particularly the first lockdown, and that brought through voices that I think may otherwise have been missed. Just one other example. I mentioned our Youth Combined Authority before. They oversee a survey of year 10s in Greater Manchester. We think we're the only place in the country to do this, to survey teenagers on a regular basis. And we're about to publish the results of that survey today. And well, it won't surprise people on this call to know that there's a big dip in levels of hope and optimism. Young people reporting concerns about mental health. Not in some ways surprising, but at least we're hearing about it, and they are telling us what they think they need coming out of the crisis. So again, Heather, I'm not going to overclaim and say we've got it perfect, but we do work hard to hear voices that might otherwise not be heard in the policy debate.
Okay, someone's come in with my last question as well, which is which I've now lost because my phone. Bear with me a second. So you're a former health secretary, and you've got Greater Manchester has devolved health. Local government always seems to be battling over central government about whether or not it should health should go back into or care should be nationalised. So we've got Chris Ham asking, how would devolution work with a national care service? It's suggesting here that you're an advocate of that. Is that your view? Do you think we should have a national care service?
I am an advocate of it, Chris, in that when I say that, I'm talking about the way in which social care is funded. I'm talking about NHS terms for the provision of social care, free at the point of use, according to need. But that doesn't mean that you then dictate how it has to be provided. So the national bit of a national care service linking to a national health service would dictate the what should be people's entitlement to care at the national level, but how that is provided should be a devolved responsibility. So that's the way I would separate those two things. The what is a national decision, for the tax that's put in, here's what everybody should, this is what everybody should receive. But then it should be a devolved responsibility for local areas to decide how best to meet that within their areas in a way that's appropriate for their community. So I think it is possible. It's not a binary choice. Do you have a national thing or a devolved thing? There is a sort of a way of balancing, isn't there, to get the balance right. And I think the integrated care systems the government are talking about, well, depends, doesn't it? But potentially are interesting. If you imagine this, if those systems had combined health and social care budgets funded on the same basis, free at the point of use, covering people's personal care as well as their health care, I think you would create the conditions for quite a radical change towards more person-centred preventative care in people's homes. Because finally, the incentive would be to invest in keeping people out of hospital. At the moment, that incentive isn't baked into the system. And I think that is what I mean when I talk about a national care service. It's about a health and social care system that speak the same funding language and therefore can align their priorities and can move in a more preventative direction. And that, if you think about it, if you were to redesign community-based, preventative, person-centred health and care services, you would need quite a lot of latitude for people at the local level to be free to design what those services look like. So yeah, I hope that answers the point, Chris. I recognise I'm talking to an expert when you ask a question like that.
Okay, and we've got one last one. We've probably only got a minute or so left, but what are your thoughts on the new white paper for the NHS and integrated care systems?
It sounds promising. I mean, Chris might remember I made a speech at the King's Fund in 2014, where I was, I think, the first national politician to call for the full integration of health and social care. The speech was called Whole Person Care. And I think this is getting close to that same vision, I think. I would have some, is it the right time to reorganise the NHS? Question, possibly not. But I am pleased that the Lansley reforms are being removed 10 years too late, in my view, but at least that they are. So yeah, I in some ways, I think the white paper gets as close as we've ever got to a political consensus, I think, around the future of healthcare. If they can reform the funding of social care as part of this, then I think we really are in business then to both to create integrated care systems, but then devolve those integrated care systems. That sounds quite promising to me.
Okay. Can I just say a huge thank you to you, Andy, for sparing your time this morning to talk to us. I think it's been really interesting, and I really look forward to seeing how Greater Manchester comes out of the pandemic with a much more enhanced community offer.
I think we will, Heather. And I think, what should we say, Donna? I can see your comment in the chat. A joint bid for Job Share PM 2020, no, 2029 or 2034. Which one do you want?
Excellent. That'd be.
I'm in.
It'd be really nice to see more than one directly elected mayor getting into to the PM's office. I think it's a good move for local democracy to see that that's a career path. I'm going to hand back to, I believe you've got breakout sessions now, but I'm going to hand back to Adam, I think, hopefully, and just say thank you once again to you, Andy, and thank you to New Local for inviting me to come and speak to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you both. That was so interesting, and it's so nice actually to hear a politician speaking in such an open and frank and relaxed way. Really, thank you so much, and for being such a great advocate of devolution and community power. When you and Donna, well, Donna as PM, you as Chancellor, I think, absolutely, the country will be sorted. Not far off. And we can say it all started here on the chat on Stronger Things.